You fool! Warren is dead.
Welcome to HorrorBabble. Once again, I'm pleased to return this year with our 8th 12 Days of Christmas special. This time, we're off to the fictional Manchester suburb of Lowther, into the gaping maw of Cecelia, Davenport. When 9-year-old Betsy moves with her father to the quiet town of Lowther, she senses that something is wrong long before the adults do. Children begin to vanish, the streets empty, and a strange woman known only as the Bag Lady roams the town's forgotten paths. As always, the story is a 12-parter, with each episode airing daily from today through to January 6th. If you want to wait for the whole thing, it'll be published in full on January 12th. Thanks as always for listening, folks. I wouldn't be able to put time into these things without your support. And without further ado, Into the Gaping Maw of Cecelia, Davenport by Ian Gordon. Part 1. Buckingham Street. There was nothing particularly remarkable about that row of houses, except perhaps for where they stood, the quiet, half-forgotten Manchester suburb of Lowther. When it rains in the town, the streets flood. When the wind comes, it doesn't just blow, it screams through the terraces like a jet breaking the sound barrier. When it snows, the thaw turns to a thick, grey soup that makes walking an ordeal. And when, on those rare occasions, the sun decides to show its face, it only manages to light the upper floors of the tenement blocks that hem the town in from the south, leaving Lowther itself in a kind of permanent, moss-coloured twilight. No, there was nothing particularly remarkable about that row of houses, except for where they stood and the woman who lived at number 44. But we'll learn about her later. Under certain conditions, viewed from the other side of the canal, lit by the moon, Buckingham Street looked almost pretty. The terraces rose in a neat brick line, front doors facing a narrow strip of grass that ran down the middle. At the far end of the grass, bent a little from one too many winters, stood a metal sign that read, in pebbled black letters, "No ball games." The sign was not obeyed. On most afternoons, and even on cold Sundays like this one, the grass belonged to the children. They scuffed it up into mud, wore paths through it, shouted themselves hoarse over rules that changed every 5 minutes, and paid the sign about as much attention as the pigeons did. Behind the upstairs window of number 22, a girl stood watching. Betsy Carr pressed her forehead to the cold glass and tried to ignore the sound of her dad's radio downstairs. Tinny music, a presenter talking about closures on a road she'd never heard of. Her focus was the kids outside, the thump of a ball, a boy's voice yelling, "Pass it!" a girl laughing, someone calling offside with great authority. The Carrs, Betsy and her dad Steve, had been on Buckingham a few weeks now, long enough for the novelty of a new house to fade, long enough for the smell of the carpets to disappear, but not quite long enough for Betsy to feel that any of it belonged to her. "Bets!" Steve's voice floated up the stairs, marked by a tired brightness. "You gonna come and give us a hand or what?" She dragged herself from the window and made her way downstairs. Her dad was in the front room, kneeling on a dust sheet with a paintbrush in his hand, making slow work of the skirting board. The house reeked of gloss and damp plaster. "You said I could go out," Betsy said. "Remember?" Steve sat back on his heels and looked at her. 9 years old, wild golden hair that resisted the brush, knees grubby from kneeling on the windowsill to see outside. She had her mum's eyes, big and blue, which was both a comfort and a problem. "You met any of them yet?" he asked, nodding towards the window. "Them lot outside?" "Yeah," she said. "There's Alan, never shuts up. Alice, she's all right. Rose is scared of worms. Brandon, he's the weird one." "Go on then," Steve said, smiling. "If you're going, go, but stay where I can see you. Don't be wandering off." Betsy nodded affirmatively. "Good, and if it gets dark, you're in, yeah?" "Okay," she said. She grabbed her coat from the peg in the hallway, wrestled her arms into it, and let herself out. The cold Sunday air met her with that humid lather heaviness, the stench of wet brick and the canal. Her breath came out in little puffs as she crossed the flagstones to the grass. Alan spotted her first. Of course he did. "Aye," he shouted, as if she lived at the far end of the street instead of directly opposite. "You playing or what?" Alice waved, dark cheeks pink from the cold, hair escaping its bobble. Rose stood slightly back from the others, clutching her sleeves over her hands, watching the ball like it might explode. "Yeah, okay," Betsy said. "Bran!" Alan barked instantly, directing the boy like a drill sergeant. "Get in goal, man!" Brandon, a tall but timid character, groaned and trudged between two jumpers that had been flung down to mark the posts. The game resumed in that chaotic way children's games do. For a while, the cold was forgotten. Betsy ran until her chest ached, rainbow welly boots slapping wet grass. She fluffed an easy shot, and Alan called her useless in a way that somehow didn't really sting. Rose, more a shrinking violet, squealed every time the ball came near her ankles, though managed, through sheer terror, to block 2 attempts on goal. The terraces watched in silence. 22 with its flaking paint and newly scrubbed windows, 20 with its net curtains yellowed by cigarettes, and 44 right across from the cars, its small front garden enclosed by a low fence and a row of clipped shrubs like dutiful beefeaters. 44 was different. No discarded toys, no bikes leaning at drunken angles, no worn path from gate to door. The grass was a short, uniform green. The flower beds were stripped bare for winter, turned and tidy. The keeper of the yard took meticulous care. But the kids didn't notice any of that. Gardens were for grown-ups to worry about. It happened on a miss kick. Alan went for a heroic volley, misjudged it completely, and caught the ball with the side of his shoe. It sailed off at an angle, climbed gracefully over the little fence, and dropped onto the immaculate lawn of 44. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. The ball just sat there. "Nice one," Alice said. "It were the wind," Alan protested, blushing. "I'll get it." The red-headed boy was already heading for the fence. He swung a leg over, then the other, before dropping lightly onto the forbidden grass. "Go on, then," Alice encouraged softly. "Hurry up." Alan crept forward with exaggerated stealth, milking it for all it was worth. He bent, grabbed the ball, straightened up, and held it aloft like a trophy. And that was when they heard it. At first, Betsy thought it was a dog, a big one, a low, guttural sound emerging from the pristine facade of 44. It rolled, deep and wet, like something clearing its throat. Alan froze. The ball slipped from his hands and thudded back onto the grass. Alice shook her head without taking her eyes off the house. The curtains were drawn. No light showed around their edges. The growling rose again. It seemed to move from one side of the house to the other, as if pacing back and forth. "Come on, Al," Brandon pleaded. "Just leave it. We'll play something else." The idea of the ball staying there, abandoned on that manicured grass, felt somehow worse than the idea of a dog. Alan took a careful step forward, hauled the ball up under one arm, and in the same movement turned and lobbed it back over the fence. Betsy flinched as it came towards her, hands up. The ball bounced off the no-ball game signpost and rolled to a stop next to Alice's foot. "Told you," Alan said, though his voice was thin now. "No problem." He vaulted the fence, landing less elegantly than before. Rose grabbed his sleeve and yanked him away from the garden. The growling stopped as abruptly as it had begun. For a moment, the only sound was the hiss of passing traffic on a street out of sight, somewhere beyond the end of Buckingham. "Let's play at the other end," Alice said, a little too briskly. "By the bin sheds." "I don't know," Betsy said, scanning the purple sky above. "I need to go in soon." "Yeah," Alan managed, huffing. "Me too. Let's play again tomorrow, yeah?" And it was with eager steps that each of the 5 children returned to their respective homes. Back at 22, Steve served up a pan of something that involved pasta and a jar of sauce. Proper grub, he called it. Betsy proceeded to tell him, in the half-distracted way of children, about goals scored and arguments over throw-ins. She didn't mention the garden or the growling. After tea, Steve washed up, while Betsy absently watched the end of a horror film. A weird one, she thought, involving a deranged madman stalking a cinema. She found herself glancing through the open curtains from time to time, her thoughts a mixture of the horror blaring from the TV screen and the growling noises she'd heard outside 44. It was blacker than black out there. The street lamp in front of the house was utterly dead. Anyone could be out there. Anyone or anything. Neither idea appealed to her overactive imagination. Later, when Betsy was in bed and the house had shrunk to its nighttime creaks and sighs, Steve decided he'd earned a smoke. He threw his coat on over his t-shirt, shoved his feet into his boots without lacing them, and stepped out of the front door with a familiar blend of relief and guilt. The cold bit harder now. His breath rose in small, crooked clouds. He cupped his hands around the cigarette as he lit it, the flame briefly illuminating his face and the chipped paint of the front step. He took a drag, exhaled, and listened. The distant hum of the ring road, a dog barking 2 streets over, a burst of laughter from an upstairs window somewhere. He wasn't a fan of Buckingham Street, not a huge supporter of Lowther in general, but there they were, father and daughter, happy together in spite of the challenges life had thrown at them. The coffers were light, work inconsistent, but they were managing, surviving. Bets was a tough little egg. She had to be, really. What choice did she have? What choice did either of them have? Since Ellie had passed... But no, he wasn't going to dwell on that. He finished the cigarette, shivering, and cast a cynical eye at the lifeless street lamp. "Need to get that sorted," he said under his breath, as if someone from the council might be listening. He turned and went back inside. Behind him, the street resumed its silent watch. The empty grass lay in its pocket of darkness, the no-ball game sign a pale smudge. Across the way, in one of the quiet, gloom-shrouded houses, a curtain shifted and fell still again, as if something had just moved back from the window.